The wind howled through the cracks in the old wooden fence, rattling the loose boards like they were trying to break free. She stood there, gripping the straps of her worn-out bag, staring at the house she once called home. The windows glowed with warm light, laughter echoing from inside voices she knew too well. But they didn't know she was here. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. Her fingers tightened around the cold metal of the gate, but she didn't push it open. Not yet. She had been shut out for too long, tossed aside like she never mattered. Now, after everything, after years of struggle, they were the ones desperate to get in. If only they knew. If only they realized that the walls they'd built to keep her out weren't as strong as they thought. She took a slow breath, the cold air burning her lungs. Memories clawed their way back, nights spent just outside that same door, waiting for it to open, for someone to change their mind. They never did. She had begged once, pleaded, cried, but their backs stayed turned, their faces indifferent. Now, things were different. Now, she had something they wanted, something they needed. Inside, the party was in full swing. Glasses clinked, voices overlapped, and the scent of expensive perfume mixed with the rich aroma of catered food. They were celebrating something, another success, another deal, another reason to remind the world just how untouchable they were. But behind the smiles and the polished appearances, she knew the truth. The cracks were there, waiting to split wide open. She took a step forward. The old wood creaked under her weight, but no one inside heard. Not yet. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper, something sharper. The kind of feeling that came when the balance of power shifted. They had shut her out, erased her, like she was nothing. But now, they weren't the ones in control. She could walk away. She could leave them to their fate. But that wasn't why she had come back. No, she was here for something else. Something they wouldn't see coming. The night stretched long and dark around her, but inside, the clock was ticking. The moment would come, just like she knew it would. And when it did, they would realize what it felt like to be on the outside, looking in. The wind pressed against her back as she moved closer to the house, her breath coming out in slow, measured exhales. The past was thick in the air, wrapping around her like invisible chains. But she wasn't the same person who had once stood outside these doors, hoping no, begging to be let in. That girl was gone. The music inside pulsed through the walls, muffled but strong, a reminder of the world that had moved on without her. She could hear laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses. They were celebrating something, just like always. They lived in their perfect little bubble, untouched by the things they had done. But tonight, that was about to change. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small piece of paper, its edges worn from the number of times she had folded and unfolded it. A name, a time, a warning. She had debated whether to come at all, whether it was worth it. But then she remembered the way they had turned their backs, the way they had locked the doors without a second thought. Her fingers hovered over the doorbell. It would be so easy to press it, to force them to face her. But no. That was what they would expect the girl they had cast out, standing at their doorstep, desperate for scraps of attention. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she took a step back, blending into the shadows of the trees lining the yard. They didn't know she was here. Not yet. But they would. Inside, the voices swirled. Some louder than others. Some familiar. Too familiar. She's long gone anyway. You think she'd ever come back after? Doesn't matter. Even if she did, it's not like we'd... The voice cut off, swallowed by laughter. Her fingers curled into fists. They still thought they had won. They still believed she was nothing. A car pulled into the driveway, its headlights sweeping across the yard. She pressed herself against the side of the house, watching as the driver stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. He looked annoyed, like he didn't want to be here. He glanced at his phone before heading up the steps. The door opened before he even knocked. She caught a glimpse of the warm, glowing interior before the door shut again. Her stomach twisted. It used to be her world too once. A long time ago. She turned away, her pulse steady now. She didn't need their invitation. She didn't need their approval. But they were about to need her. And when that moment came, when they realized just how badly they had miscalculated, she wanted to be close enough to see the looks on their faces. The night stretched on, the cold settling deep into her skin, but she didn't move. She had waited too long for this moment to rush it now. The house still pulsed with life, voices rising and falling behind those walls, safe and warm. They didn't know what was coming. She watched the front door, her breath steady. More guests arrived, laughing as they stepped inside, shrugging off their coats like they belonged. And maybe they did. Maybe they had never been forced out. Never been left alone in the dark, with nowhere to go. Her fingers brushed the edge of her pocket, where her phone rested. One call. One message. That was all it would take to change everything. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. She moved along the side of the house, careful to stay in the shadows. The windows on this side were dark, covered with thick curtains. She knew the layout too well. If she wanted, she could slip in unseen. But she didn't need to. They would come to her soon enough. Inside, someone raised a glass, their voice carrying over the others. A toast. She couldn't make out all the words, but she caught the important ones. Success. Future. Moving forward. Funny. They thought the past was gone. Buried. They didn't realize that some things don't just disappear. She stepped back, her boots crunching lightly against the gravel. She had to be careful. The last thing she needed was for them to notice her too soon. This had to play out the right way. A figure moved past one of the windows, a shadow against the dim light. Her chest tightened. It had been years, but she knew that walk, that stance. Nothing had changed. At least, not for them. For her, everything had. She turned, slipping away from the house, disappearing into the darkness as easily as she had come. Let them have their night. Let them believe everything was fine. Because when they finally realized the truth, that the thing they had shut out was the only thing that could save them, it would already be too late. She kept her distance, her footsteps light as she made her way down the quiet street. The night air was sharp against her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, pieces shifting into place, each one leading her closer to the moment she had been waiting for. They were still inside, drinking, laughing, completely unaware. She had left them alone for years, never looking back, never reaching out, and they had been fine with that. No apologies, no guilt, as if she had never existed at all. But now, the cracks in their perfect world were beginning to show. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, the screen glowing in the dark. A message. Short. Urgent. We need to talk. Now. She stared at it for a moment, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. Not yet. Let them sweat a little longer. She turned the corner, keeping to the edge of the street, her eyes locked on the house. The music had died down, the voices softer now. It was getting late, but the most important part of the night was still coming. A car pulled up in front of the house, the tires crunching against the pavement. The door opened, and someone stepped out, moving quickly toward the entrance. She tensed, watching as the figure hesitated, glancing around before disappearing inside. She knew that hesitation, knew what it meant. They were nervous. Good. She moved closer, careful to stay hidden. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see them gathered in the living room. Their faces were tight, their bodies stiff. The laughter was gone now. Something was wrong, and they knew it. Her pulse quickened. The moment was coming. One of them pulled out a phone, typing fast, frustration clear on their face. Another paced near the window, their hands on their hips, glancing toward the door every few seconds. They were waiting for something, or someone. She took a slow breath, then reached into her pocket, wrapping her fingers around her phone. A simple message was all it would take. Just a few words. But she didn't send it. Not yet. She wanted to see it first. The exact moment they realized. The exact second when it all came crashing down. Because once they did, once they understood what was happening, there would be no going back. Her fingers hovered over the phone screen, the message half-typed, the weight of it pressing down on her like a secret too big to hold. She could end it now, press send and watch everything unravel in real time. But something held her back. A feeling deep in her gut, telling her to wait just a little longer. Inside, the tension was rising. The pacing, the hushed voices, the way they kept checking their phones, it was clear now. They weren't just anxious. They were afraid. And that was the part she hadn't expected. What were they afraid of? She had spent so long thinking about how this night would go, picturing their shock, their regret, their desperation. But now watching them, she realized something was off. They weren't just waiting for something to happen. They were bracing for it. A shadow moved across the window, a flicker of motion so quick she almost missed it. Someone was outside. But it wasn't her. Her body went still, her senses sharpening. She wasn't the only one watching the house. She turned, scanning the street, the driveway, the darkened corners where the streetlights didn't quite reach. Nothing. But she could feel it, the presence of someone else lurking just beyond sight. Had they known she would be here? Had someone followed her? She shifted deeper into the shadows, her heart pounding now for a different reason. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had been so careful, so patient. But if there was someone else circling the house, it meant she wasn't the only one who had unfinished business here. Inside, one of them moved toward the door, hesitating before unlocking it. The door cracked open, and a man stepped in, his face tight with something close to panic. His words came fast, low, urgent. The others froze, their expressions darkening. Something was wrong. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to leave. This wasn't her fight. Whatever was happening inside, it had nothing to do with her. And yet, she had spent years believing she was the one who had been wronged. That she was the only one carrying the weight of the past. But now, standing here, watching them, she realized she might have missed something. Something big. They weren't celebrating tonight. They weren't moving forward. They were trying to cover something up. And she wasn't the only one coming for them. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. She watched from the shadows, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. The man who had just entered was speaking fast, his movement sharp with urgency. Whatever he had told them, it wasn't good. One of them, the one who used to hold all the power, ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening as he muttered something under his breath. Another sat down, burying her face in her hands. The others exchanged uneasy glances, their carefully crafted world beginning to crack right in front of her. Then, just as she thought she had pieced it together, the front door swung open again. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her breath catching as another figure stepped inside. Tall, confident, a presence that sent a ripple of tension through the entire room. She recognized him instantly. It had been years, but his face was burned into her memory. The way he carried himself, the way the others stiffened at his arrival. It all made sense now. This wasn't just about her anymore. She had thought she was the one forcing them to face the past, but she was wrong. Something bigger had been chasing them all along. One of them spoke first, their voice shaking. "We didn't know." The man tilted his head, studying them with an expression that made her stomach turn. "You didn't know?" he repeated, his tone calm, but there was something behind it, something cold. "That's funny. Because I do." The room was silent. Then, without warning, he pulled something from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft thud, and even from where she was standing, she could see their faces go pale. She knew that feeling. The way the ground shifts beneath your feet when the truth finally catches up to you. She had spent years thinking she was the one who had been left behind, that she was the only one with something to reclaim. But now, standing there, she realized she was just one thread in a much bigger story. And tonight, all of it was unraveling. She took a step back, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had come here to watch them fall, to make them feel what she had felt. But now, she wasn't sure she wanted to be anywhere near them when it happened. She took another step back, the cold air pressing against her skin, but she couldn't move any further. Something kept her there, held her in place, as the scene inside the house unfolded. The tension in the room thickened. No one reached for the object on the table, but they all stared at it, as if touching it would make their worst fears real. The man who had thrown it down leaned forward slightly, watching them with sharp, calculating eyes. He wasn't in a hurry. He was waiting for them to break, to confess, to do something that would confirm what he already knew. She could see it now, clearer than ever. They weren't just guilty of shutting her out. They had been hiding something else. And whatever it was, it had finally caught up with them. One of them, the one who always knew how to smooth things over, how to spin a story so it sounded better than it was spoke first. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for a drink. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said, his tone measured. "We don't even know if—" "Don't," the man cut in, his voice cold. "Don't lie to me. Not now." Silence. Then the woman at the far end of the room, the one who had buried her face in her hands, exhaled sharply, and finally looked up. "We thought it was over," she whispered. "We thought." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" The man let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "That's what you're calling it." He stepped closer, his presence casting a long shadow over the table. "No, a mistake is something you do once. This was a choice. And now you're going to deal with it." Her stomach twisted as she watched them crumble under the weight of their own secrets. She had wanted this, to see them shaken, afraid, realizing they weren't untouchable after all. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel as satisfying as she thought it would. She had spent years telling herself that all she wanted was to make them pay, to remind them of what they had done. But she wasn't the only one who had been waiting. This man, whoever he was, had come with a purpose, and his presence changed everything. She turned, her fingers gripping the rough bark of a tree as she steadied herself. She had gotten what she came for. She had seen the fear in their eyes, heard the cracks in their voices. But if she stayed any longer, she would be pulled into something deeper, something she wasn't ready for. She took one last look at the house, the place she had once thought she belonged, the people who had shut her out without hesitation. And then, for the first time in a long time, she turned away willingly. She walked down the street, each step lighter than the last. She had held onto the past for too long, carried it with her like a weight she couldn't put down. But tonight, she wasn't the one trapped anymore. And that was enough.